Um, Thank you very much for joining us here for a backyard composting workshop. My name is Robin. I am the Community and Event Outreach Coordinator for CSWD, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Ethan. You want to introduce yourself, Ethan, and let folks know how the Q&A part will work since you're our Q&A wrangler?
Sure. My name is Ethan Hausman. I'm Business Outreach for CSWD, and we would ask that you plug in today through the Q&A, engage with us, questions or comments. We're happy to get questions about anything at any time, although we'll probably save the ones that we have for topics that we haven't yet gotten to until we get there. So do use the Q&A. Also, you'll probably want to check the already answered questions. That's another second tab, because there may be questions that you have that are already answered, and that will save us having to bounce back and forth. Back to you, Robin.
All right, thanks. Let's go ahead and get started here. Just a little technical pause while I share my screen. We'll get going. Oops, that's supposed to be from beginning. That is very strange. Let's see here. Now I can't figure out how to unpause my sharing. I have to stop and start again. Sorry about that, folks.
Maybe while you get that up, we can just talk about what we'll be doing today. Sure. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the background, and then we'll be moving into the steps. And it looks like Robin's ready to go. So
yeah, my apologies for that little glitch. Those sorts of things do happen. So as Ethan was just starting to say, I'm going to do just a really quick intro to CSWD so folks know who we are, why we're doing this. Then we're going to talk about why composting, go through the steps of how composting works, and go through the 6 steps of what we have to do to make it happen. And we'll pause at various points if there are lots of questions, but we'll definitely make sure we have time at the end for questions. So CSWD, the Chittenden Solid Waste District, is a municipal entity. All the towns of Chittenden County have joined as members, and we are governed by a board of commissioners that has 1 representative from each of those towns, and they vote proportional. They have a number of votes that's proportional to their representation. So folks are equally balanced. We have several drop-off facilities where people can bring household trash, regular old blue bin recycling, plus lots of other special recycling like batteries and scrap metal that are very recyclable items but cannot go into your blue bin. We also run Green Mountain Compost, which is a commercial composting facility. The MRF, Materials Recovery Facility, is where all of the blue bin recyclables go to get sorted. And then we also have an environmental depot, which is where we collect hazardous materials from folks. Unlike most places, our environmental depot is open all year round, and 4 days a week to the general public. So folks in many parts of the state and region have to wait for like 1 pickup day a month or twice a year. So we are richly blessed. Today, we're going to be talking about backyard composting. It's not the only way people can manage their food scraps, but that's what we're going to focus on today. You can drop off your food scraps at our drop-off centers, as we discussed, as I mentioned earlier. But managing them on site is an option that a lot of folks will choose. So just to make sure we're talking the same language here, sometimes people don't mean the same thing when they use the term compost. So the way I'm going to be using the term is pile B here is compost. That is finished compost that's already been through the process. Pile A is food scraps or materials that go into the compost pile that will turn into compost. And I'll refer to them at various times as food scraps or just as organics, because as we'll learn, there are other things we add to that pile besides just the food scraps. And then pile C is just a handful of dirt. So you can just see by looking at it, the difference in how rich the compost is, all those nutrients that are just yummy to plants. That's what makes compost such a great soil amendment. You mix it with the regular soil and it just does wonders for all the things that are trying to grow there. So just real quickly, I assume you're already on board with this or you wouldn't be here, but the reasons we want to keep food scraps out of the landfill is primarily to conserve those resources. Food is full of yummy nutrients. That's what keeps us all going. And it's just a shame to throw those away into the landfill and then have to use artificial fertilizers to keep our soil rich and growing things. By keeping them out of the landfill, they just break down as part of a natural process. They go back into the soil and they help us grow the next generation of food. And then those food scraps continue the cycle. It's just really sad to see those resources just get locked up and buried in a landfill. The whole process, for a bunch of different reasons, reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second really key point is that it saves finite landfill space. So if we aren't composting, if we're just throwing them in the trash, this is where food scraps go. And a lot of people think, well, what difference does it make? They're going to break down, right? So why can't we just throw them in the landfill? And the answer is they really don't. When you ask the question, what happens to food scraps in a landfill? The answer is not much. These are carrots that were dug up out of a landfill. They were 10 years old, at which they could tell because they were buried right near a newspaper that was 10 years old, and you could still read the newsprint. The thing about landfills these days is they're built very reasonably, and for, it's very important. They are built to make sure that icky stuff doesn't leach out into the environment. We don't want chemicals getting into our groundwater. We don't want, gases coming out and increasing global warming. But as the side effect of sealing that all up to protect the environment is that the stuff that's in there is stuck in there. So even if it did break down, none of those nutrients are going to go back into the soil. They're just buried in like what looks essentially like a big swimming pool. Conversely, when you put those things into a compost pile, they disappear really fast and they turn into great nutrition. Our colleague Rhonda, who's the school outreach coordinator, did an experiment so she could show her students what happens. She took these carrots, fresh carrots, she put them in a mesh bag, buried them in a compost pile, and then just pulled it out of the pile once a week and weighed the carrots and took pictures. And they were completely gone in 9 weeks, which astonished everyone involved. We thought it would take longer than that. But in just 2 weeks, they're already looking pretty mushy and non-carrot-like. By 4 weeks, you can't even tell what they are. And by 9 weeks, you're just holding a beautiful pile of fresh, rich compost. So it's just tragic to throw that stuff into a landfill, bury it in a hole when we could be using it to feed the earth. So what makes composting happen? It's not us. It's these little critters, fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates, the FBI. They are the workhorses that are making all this happen. We are just sort of collecting stuff in one place for it to happen, but composting happens all around us all the time as just a fact of nature. Leaves fall off the trees, they break down, they become part of the soil that helps the trees continue to grow and other things to grow. It doesn't need any help from us. And so composting can be super easy. You can basically just chuck stuff in a pile and wait. That nature will take care of it eventually. But there are a lot of ways by managing it a little more carefully that you can avoid some problems like odors that might affect critters. And you can make the process happen a lot faster if you're a gardener who's really interested in harvesting the compost when it's done. All that needs to happen for food scraps to turn into beautiful compost is just the same things that we need to thrive. Food, water, air, and comfy temperatures. So the food that goes into a pile is two things, both the food scraps that we are just talking about and that are pictured here, and those are great sources of nitrogen, or we call it green food. But in order to decompose rapidly and without odors, that green food needs to be balanced with brown food, which is sources of carbon. And that's going to be things like dried leaves or ripped up newspaper, ripped up grocery bags, cardboard, sawdust, things like that. Brown or dried grass clippings, like if you've mowed your lawn and then just thrown all the clippings into a pile until they dry, that'll be nice brown stuff to mix in with your food scraps. And then air, obviously, it's all around us. If you want to help make sure all those critters have enough air to breathe, you can fluff up your pile every now and then, stir it, flip it over, just to make sure there's air circulating throughout the whole pile. And water, which will just appear naturally out of the sky as rain. There are times when it's a little dry, or you just want to speed things along that you might want to add water. And we'll talk in a little bit about how to know how your compost pile will tell you that it needs a little more water or a little more air. And now we get into the 6 steps to composting. So the first thing you need to do is choose a system. What kind of system are you going to use? There are basically, they fall into 2 broad categories. One is called batch composting, and that's things like a tumbler that's its own self-contained unit. It's not in contact with the ground or the natural environment. It's like a barrel that's hanging. You open the stuff, you put all the ingredients in for your compost, close the door, mix it up, and just let it happen. The other types are called continuous composting systems. And that's the kind of product that we sell, a continuous composting system called the Soil Saver. And that's where it's basically just is a plastic unit that just contains your piles. It just puts 4 walls around your pile and a lid, which a lot of people prefer for aesthetic reasons, or to make it even less enticing to critters. So we'll talk a little bit more about why one of those systems might work better than another for you. You need to find the right spot to put it. Then you need to collect your scraps in your house, build your pile to make sure it has enough green and brown goodies, then just let nature do its work. And finally, at the end, you can harvest your rich resources. So now we're going to do another little bit of technological wrangling here, and Ethan is going to show a video that highlights him, starring Ethan, on how to choose a system and a location.
Are you seeing my screen, Robin?
We I
So
am.
if you decided that you want to pursue backyard composting, and that's not your only option, there are other ways you can do it, like drop-off composting. But if you're interested in pursuing backyard composting, then you have some decisions to make about how you want to do it. There are 6 steps to that process of backyard composting, starting with choosing your system, choosing a site or siting your container, the materials you add to it, picking the right materials, building your pile, letting it cook down or compost, and then harvesting from it, using it in the garden. So starting with what container or system you want to use. You have a few basic categories as options. One example is our soil saver over there. This is a very basic system. It is just a plastic box. Does not have even a floor in it, in fact, but you can either put it on something like a piece of plywood, or you can just let it rest right on the ground. It is easy to open, but does lock down. So one of its features is that it secures from pests, and it is very affordable. On the downside, you will need to turn the material by hand, so it's a little bit more labor intensive, but durable, simple, functional. If you're interested in getting a little bit more creative, you can build your own composting system. And what we would recommend is a 2 or 3 bin system. And what you see here is an example of a 3 bin system made from pallets. You can also make these from virtually anything, including cinder blocks or hardware cloth, chicken wire type stuff, and stakes. These are obviously harder to secure, but it certainly can be done, as you see here on the bay that we add to. But often the benefit of these is that it's a rotational system, so that you're adding to one bay and you're flipping it into the next bay when it's ready. The next option you would have would be some sort of a tumbler system. And a tumbler system is different than a soil saver in that it is not directly on the ground. So critters from the ground can't get directly into it, but you do not need to turn it by hand. You just need to crank it, and it does the work of adding the air and giving the critters what they need in terms of mixing the material. Finally, you have a system like what we have up here called a green cone, and that is a digester, not a composter. And there are some fundamental differences we'll get into more, but it impacts the kind of materials you can use in it, and it has a lot of implications for siting. So we'll talk about the mostly limitations around under what circumstances in terms of available siting you can use a green cone. And in fact, we might as well jump into that now, since siting is topic number 2 in planning your backyard composting. So, what you need for a green cone is well-draining soil. So it really needs to be sandy or gravelly, and you can create that yourself if you're willing to do the extra work. Otherwise, you just need to have that in the area that you choose to dig your hole for it. It also really needs direct sunlight. It needs to be aided with the heat provided by being in the sun. And so if you only can find a shady spot, that is not going to be a good fit for you, and we'd recommend a composter instead. As far as siting a composter, you are going to want to think about how to secure it. You're going to want to think about proximity and convenience. The closer to be more convenient for you, especially in the winter, if you're going to have to shovel your way out there. But also keep in mind that there will be some extra fly activity around it, so you're not going to want it right up against your house. It also can attract some critters, although if you do it well, that's less of a concern, particularly if you make it inaccessible, like as the soil saver does with the clamp down lids. Always good if you can get it some extra solar by putting it in the sun as well. One more oft overlooked consideration when it comes to siting your compost container or even your digester, your green cone, is tree roots. There really is a concentration of nutrients that will be emanating from your composter. And unless your composter is off the ground or you have set on something, tree roots will have access to those nutrients and they will seek them out. They will actually grow from the ground, your composter, and add root mass, especially if you're not turning it regularly. So we would suggest Not citing your compost bins exactly where you see these next to the woods. Avoid trees and shrubs when citing.
So now I'm going to demonstrate how we use our
Yep. Is that the end?
Yep, back to you.
All right. So let's see, just make that little thing go away. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple different ingredients you want to put into your pile. One thing to consider, as Ethan mentioned the green cone as an option, and there are pluses and minuses to that. But one thing with composting is that there are certain food materials that you do not want to put in a backyard compost system, like meat and bones, dairy products, things that are really fatty. It's not because they won't break down, they will, but it's because they might tend to get a little smelly. The backyard compost system might not get hot enough to kill any, pathogens or nasty bacteria that might be in there. And it might tend to attract critters. Those things can all go to Green Mountain Compost. So if you're backyard composting, you can just keep those things separate and bring them to us to get composted. You are also still allowed to put them in the trash. If backyard composting is your food scrap solution, the law that made separating food scraps mandatory does allow for home composters to keep putting non-home compostable things into the trash. The green cone, on the other hand, it does take meat and bones and dairy products. It takes all kinds of food, which is a benefit. On the other hand, it does not take all of the other things. It doesn't want any of those carbon sources. It doesn't want leaves, garden weeds, grass clippings, anything like that. It's only food. So it might be a good solution if you aren't interested, if you don't have a lot of space where you're needing to get rid of leaves and grass and things, if you don't have a garden that you're going to be pulling weeds out of. Because it can accommodate all of your food scraps. And another side effect of it is it does not produce compost like a composter. It's the bottom part of it is just buried in the soil. And so all the nutrients just seep right out into the soil around it. So there's nothing you dig out and put onto your garden. So if you're looking for a source to improve your soil, then it's going to do that only in its immediate vicinity. You're not going to be able to take that and improve your soil somewhere else. So Ethan, unless there are any questions that we need to address right now, I'm going to play this video with Rhonda showing us how to take those materials, your green and brown materials, and build a pile that's going to work.
Yep, I think that's good. We have some questions that we'll be getting to very soon.
All right, here we go.
All right, so you've got the kind of compost system you want or digester. We've got our site selection. So the next thing to choose is, or the next thing to address, I should say, is what kind of stuff can you compost? Well, anything that comes from a plant or an animal technically can be composted. Mother Nature is composting all the time. And that compost, the finished compost, is what's going to feed your garden or your lawn or the trees in the woods behind me, right? Compost is humus is the technical term for compost, right? That's what Mother Nature creates. And we, because we're impatient, like to speed things up, and because typically we tend to be a bit wasteful, we have a lot more things to compost than, say, Mother Nature does. All right, so what kind of things? Food scraps, all right? And we're talking backyard system right now. And so in your backyard system, when you're composting, we recommend that you don't compost meat, bones, and dairy, right? And that's not because they won't compost down. It's just because critters being like raccoons and skunks and even the crows, tend to hone in on those smells and visuals. So you don't definitely, you don't really want them in it. I mean, if you don't mind, go ahead. I'll be honest, I have always composted all of my food scraps when I've composted outside. So except for raw meats and fish, I don't do that. But anything cooked, I just throw in there. So that's your choice. All right. When you're in the house, you can collect your food scraps with just about anything. Now, yes, can you get a fancy composter like, or a food scrap collector like this one? Sure you can. And it comes with this cool little charcoal filter that kind of keeps the smell down, right? I've had this for probably about 20 years, so this one's gonna stay with me, all right? Because I'm gonna keep using it. But if you're new to the game of food scrap collection, you can use anything out there. And as a matter of fact, we recommend that you do reuse whatever you have in the house, all right? Because as you know, reducing and reusing is a more important step than even recycling, including recycling your food scraps. So here we've got an old ice cream tub. We've got coffee container. Even those little lettuces that you buy in the plastic containers can be used. And all of this fits very nicely right in the fridge, so you can keep those smells down as you're collecting food scraps, all right? Or this giant coffee thing. So again, you can collect in anything. If you want to collect at home and, or collect in your kitchen and then take it to a larger bucket outside, which is what I do in my house, then you can collect in anything. So here I've got an old Home Depot bucket that I had sitting around, and that's what I store all of my food scraps in until I am ready to compost them. All right, in a big batch. So, food scraps. So without food scraps, and as we learned earlier, those microbial friends, our bacteria and the fungi, and even the invertebrates, especially outside, so those FBI agents really enjoy a certain recipe. All right, so we're gonna keep in mind 3 parts brown food, like leaves, straw, wood chips, sawdust, shredded paper, all of those little newspaper things you get in the mail. Shred those up and throw them in the compost pile. Why not, right? So all of those brown foods, you want 3 times as much brown food as you do your green food, all right? Green food being all of your food scraps, all right? High in nitrogen gives them the proteins they need to replicate. The brown foods, and today we're going to be demonstrating with leaves, all right? Brown food gives those microbes the energy they need to get the job done, all right? So now we've got our what we would call feedstocks, that's the technical term, but all of the stuff you need to build a healthy, successful, and delicious pile of food scrap, of compost. All right, so we're gonna use our backyard 3-bin system here. And we had already turned over our working bay, all right, our working side. This is the side that's gonna be cooking down. We'll talk about that in a minute. So how do we build this pile? All right, again, keeping in mind that 3-to-1 ratio, very important. Also keeping in mind 60 to 65% moisture is really critical, and probably one of the top mistakes I see in backyard composting is that people don't think that they need to water it. Well, like you, those microbes, they need water to survive. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna, we're working on building it. It's kind of like layering a lasagna, if you will. You'll hear the lasagna method a lot. All right, so I'm gonna actually just kind of dig a little ditch in the middle here, all right? Like such, with my handy dandy pitchfork, all right? This is Ethan's favorite composting tool, the pitchfork. All right, I've got my bucket of food scraps here. All right, it's about 3/4 full. And I'm just gonna dump all of that right in the middle, right like that. All right, then I'm gonna take my bucket and I'm gonna stuff it with leaves. How many buckets of leaves do I need? 3, because I have about a bucket full of here's 3. All right, easy as that. Right like that. I'm gonna spread it out a little bit I'm actually gonna use some leaves to throw around the sides too. I like to kind of insulate it from smells and attracting critters. And critters being, again, the skunks, the raccoons, all of that stuff. So I'm just gonna use what's left in here to kind of insulate around the outside. Now, I tend to be a bit of a lazy composter sometimes, so I like to throw a few sticks and twigs in there. It creates air pockets for these guys to breathe. All right, so I'm just gonna shushle that around the outside a little bit. Give it a little insulation. All right, so now the last thing to do, probably got like a little food scrap stuck in your bucket here. Maybe you have running water out there. We do not here. So you got a bucket of water here. I'm just gonna give this bucket a nice little rinse-dinsel do-ya. And I'm gonna pour that right over the top of my pile. Right like that. And this pile's pretty dry. So I think what I'm gonna do is go ahead and add a bunch of more water, even though it did just rain. And it's gonna rain later on this week. But because this is nice and open, it will dry out pretty quickly. And it's really windy here, so it'll dry out. You wanna keep a check on that, all right? So we're ready to let that cook, all right?
All right, I'm just gonna pause that for a second just to answer a few questions.
Robin, are you there?
I am here.
Cool.
All right, I was just having another little technical glitch here. So Rhonda just went through how to build your piles, and just before we get into some of the details about how to let it cook, do we have any questions we need to address, or should we just keep going here?
We did have, let's see. I think we can probably keep going and save what we have for the end.
Okay, sounds good. So one thing I do just want to emphasize is that Rhonda is showing like the ideal way to compost, but it doesn't have to. It can be as easy or as complicated as you want it to be. Rhonda, being a lazy composter, she has no idea what a lazy composter is, because I had a soil saver for 12 years at a house I used to live in. I never stirred it. I never added water to it. I never even harvested compost out the bottom. All I ever did was open the lid and throw my food scraps in and close the lid and walk away. And in 12 years, it never filled up. I never scooped anything out of the bottom. It all just sort of naturally returned to the soil. I was lucky enough to have super rich soil, so I didn't need that to enhance my garden. I just wanted a place to throw my weeds and my food scraps. So you can just totally ignore it and let nature take its course. If stirring it up and adding water and making the conditions just perfect for all those little guys doing the work will speed things up, but it isn't an absolute necessity. So don't get, if any of that stuff is scaring you off, don't worry about it. It can be pretty simple. So Ethan, you want to go ahead and launch the flipping the pile video?
I will do that.
Thank you.
Is it up for you?
Yep.
Great.
So now I'm going to demonstrate how we use our 3-bin system, our homemade system. The third bay, as we call it, is for our leaf storage. So that's where we store our leaves. So basically we're working with these 2 bays. We've cleared this one out, sieved out all of the compost, and now what we're going to do is this one's been sitting for a while. We've been filling this one up. Honestly, I mean, you would probably want to fill it all the way to the top. It's just for demonstration reasons, we're gonna flip it halfway through. So we've got about a half a bay full. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flip it over into the second bay, let that cook for another year, and then next spring, check on it, see where it's at in the composting process. Hopefully we'll sift out some of the compost, whatever the chunkies are left over, we'll put back into the system, and we'll just use, Bay 1 as our new compost pile to start building once again. So that pile will sit there for the next, till next spring, just kind of hanging out. I will check on it every so often, give it a little water and dry times. Right now, you saw with that squeeze test, it's looking pretty good. So right now it's looking fine, but I will check on that probably weekly or every other week until, winter hits. Adding water where needed and giving it a fluffle-duffle-do-ya every once in a while to circulate and kind of mix everything together. But that is flipping the pile. And now this bay is ready to start all over again with that layering of food scraps and leaves or whatever you're using for brown food. Ta-da! All right, so
Thanks, Ethan.
Sure.
Yes, I do.
This is probably a good time for us to take some questions, I would think.
Great.
So we had a few questions about things that can be added. And so craft paper or shredded paper. Do you want to talk about those items?
Sure. Hang on one second. I'm just going to stop sharing so they can see our lovely faces. So craft paper, it was craft paper and what other type?
Shredded paper.
Shredded paper. So basically any paper that's uncoated. So most craft paper, like butcher paper that you get, is uncoated, and that is fine. Same with like brown paper, shopping bags. Those, anybody uses those little brown lunch bags that I always had. Those are fine. Newspaper, office paper. What you want to avoid, also paper towels and tissues are a great option. What you want to avoid are things like your glossy newspaper inserts or waxed paper, anything that's been treated like that.
And as I typed in my answer to the question, shredded paper is fine if you're being selective about, only shredding the stuff that's truly office paper or the letters part of your junk mail, but you can't trust that the stuff that's coming in your mail is all just paper. There's sometimes those windows are not cellulose. Sometimes they really are plastic. Sometimes there's fake credit cards and things. And so I would not shred your junk mail and then put that material into your compost. But if you're just shredding office paper, that would be fine and can be a good brown.
Yeah, and it's great that it's already ripped up for you. Like you can just throw, whole sheets of newspaper or pieces of paper in there, but it'll work a little more quickly. Actually, everything that you put in there will work a little more quickly if it's in small pieces. So which just reminds me to mention, there are some things like corn cobs, eggshells, citrus peels that tend to break down a little more slowly than some other things. So sometimes people wonder, like, should I even put those in? It doesn't seem like they break down. They will break down. It'll just take more time. If you want to speed that up, just making it into smaller pieces so there's more surface area will speed it up. So chop up, crush up the eggshells in your hand. You can even put stuff through a food processor if you really want to get it tiny, but just, chop up a corn cob into 6 or 8 pieces instead of throwing them in whole. Just gives the bacteria and fungi more surface area to attack so they can get through it more quickly. But there's no reason you have to do that. It's as long as you don't mind just when you're pulling your compost out. Our next video, we're going to talk about running it through a screen to take those big chunks out, and then you can just chuck those back in the pile. So if you don't mind doing that, you can do that. If you'd rather not, then chopping them into small pieces helps.
And on the subject of citrus as well as garlic and onions, we do hear often people have heard that they shouldn't put those kind of things in their compost. Never exactly sure where that's coming from, but this person references mold as a possible concern. So I will say that I've never had any problem with composting onions, garlic, or citrus, and in fact find that those aren't among the more stubborn materials. Maybe like large citrus peels, a little bit stubborn, but I have a harder time with things like avocado skins, which are my nemesis. And I don't, as far as the mold goes, not aware of any reason why the molds they produce would be more problematic than other molds, but it's worth noting that there are various forms of mold and fungi that will be present in a compost pile that could make you sick if you were to eat your compost, not recommended, or more likely your pet sick. So you will want to keep your pile contained if you have a dog or your neighbors visit your yard a lot, because we have heard of dogs getting sick, and we're aware that there are pretty significant, not just like upset to their stomach, but neurotoxins. So that's a concern there. But otherwise, you don't need to worry about the molds if you're not eating it or nobody else is.
Yeah, boy, if you couldn't put those things in your compost, I'd have virtually nothing. I start chopping onions and garlic every night while I'm trying to decide what I'm going to have for dinner, because it's just always in there. And I eat grapefruit and lemons like they're going out of style. So that's pretty much my whole compost pile, that and lettuce.
And we haven't heard it today, but we sometimes hear the similar question about bread. Sometimes people have heard that bread is a problem in the compost. It's not. It breaks down real fast, and it's good stuff. As you know, anything that you can eat virtually can go in the compost without causing a problem. It just may come out of the process relatively unchanged if it's one of the more stubborn foods.
Yep. So even food that's gone moldy, while you were storing it in your kitchen, that doesn't matter. Just because it's not appetizing to us doesn't mean it's not appetizing to the little guys that are turning it into compost. It's just yummy, yummy to them.
So a question about when do you flip from the lasagna pile to the waiting pile?
This is where it's more of an art than a science. It's depends more on you than on anything else, because you don't even need to flip it unless you want to. So like growing up, we had just two piles always. So one year we'd start a pile. That's where we threw everything from the garden, all our food scraps into that pile. And at the end of the year, we would just start putting everything into a second pile while the first pile cooked. We didn't flip it or anything. We just started leaving that pile alone and spent the next year using the new pile. And by the time we were, that year had gone by, pile number one was just all compost that could be spread. And then we'd start a new one in that spot. So I tend to go by the calendar. Another way to think about it is if you're using a 3-bin system or a soil saver, where there's sort of a contained area, when it's full, give it a flip. And that just helps get more air through, so the little guys aren't suffocating down in the bottom. Or, as Rhonda mentioned, you can just throw in some larger sticks and things that will help make air pockets and help the water be able to travel through. But basically, you just you let the pile talk to you. If it looks like everything's working fine, then it probably is. If it seems like nothing's breaking down, it's just sitting there, there's a good chance that it's too dry and needs a little moisture. Rhonda mentioned the squeeze test, but I don't think we talked about that in great detail, but basically just—
Well, that'll be in the next video.
Is it? Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. I keep stealing the thunder of the videos by giving it all away. And if a pile starts to get super smelly and looks sort of slimy, that's a sign that it has too much water and you just want to add some more brown stuff to absorb that. You know, it's just like you're making bread or a pie crust. You can just tell if it's a little too wet, you add more flour. You know, a little too dry, add more water. It's just that kind of thing. So you can flip it if it feels like, you know, it's a little soupy and you want to mix some of that carbon in to absorb it and give those guys some space to breathe. But you can also just let it go. And the stuff at the bottom will be working while you're adding stuff at the top.
We've gotten a couple of questions about winter composting. And so I will reassure people that if your compost is frozen solid, you are in very good company. All of our compost is frozen solid, and that's just the reality of Vermont winters. It is possible to keep a compost pile going through the winter, but the main criteria for doing that is size, is just having a very large pile, bigger than any would be appropriate for any household that was just their food scraps. So like a 5 by 5 by 5 kind of pile. So for practical purposes, there is not a way to keep your pile going in the winter, which means it is the time that you will feel the most crunch in terms of capacity, whether you will have enough space for your food scraps. And it may be the time when it makes sense to think about getting a second bin just to get you through the winter. Because that is when I run out of space for sure. But it's fine for it to go dormant in that way. Nothing will break down, but the freezing and thawing cycles in the spring will tend to make everything soft and mushy. And so it will compact down and you'll get some of your space back, and it will also break down very quickly at that point once it's been mushified by the freezing thawing. So don't worry, just be prepared when it does thaw to check on it, because it will probably be too moist. Maybe not, but it's worth checking the water levels at that point and giving it a good turn, making sure it has enough browns when you can turn it again. Do you want to talk a little bit, Robin, about how this plays out? There are a couple of questions specifically about soil savers, and we'll get into a little bit of harvesting later. Do you want to talk about flipping, maintaining, and a soil saver?
You know, as I think Rhonda mentioned earlier, it's a little more challenging to stir something up when it's, you know, in a compact container. So it's just a matter of finding the right tool that works for you. Like Ethan, I prefer a pitchfork. You know, just stick it down as far as you can and turn it a little bit and pull it out. It can be a little more challenging. Well, frankly, I never really did it much, but so it wasn't problematic for me. But pitchforks are the common tool that I've seen most people use. And in the soil saver, as I think Rhonda talks about in the next video, you're adding stuff to the top, the pile's working, and then you're pulling the finished compost out the bottom. And so you just mix it up as needed, add a little water as needed, or just ignore it.
And you'll get a different answer from me slightly. I have a soil saver at home, and I early on, years ago, gave up on the idea of doing continuous composting in one soil saver. So I bought another, and my solution is that I'm adding to one pile while the other is finishing. Because I find that you can't adequately mix it and maintain layers, like finished on the bottom and food scraps on the top, if you're mixing it thoroughly, which you also need to be doing. So I have stopped. So I try to just, at some point when it's full, say, okay, I'm going to continue to mix that and monitor the water, but I'm not going to add anything to it. And that will turn into finished compost while I'm adding my fresh food scraps to the other soil saver. Somebody also asked about whether it's necessary to batch adding the food scraps in the way that Rhonda was showing. Not necessarily. You can put in large amounts at a time as long as you're putting in browns, relatively soon and not letting it go several weeks of being just a lot of food scraps without browns. But you certainly don't need to necessarily add them at the same exact time, or only add small amounts of food scraps, as long as you're prepared to mix whatever food scraps you are adding in with the browns, so that you're getting something that's not the slimy, if it's just food scraps, it's going to tend to be slimy and stinky. So the browns help make it a more appealing material as well.
Yeah. The time that batching matters is more if you're using a different type of composter, like the tumbler version, where it's just its own contained ecosystem. It's not in touch with the ground or anything else. So basically all it has to work with is what you put in there. And so those systems are designed ideally so that you put in all the ingredients all at once for a batch, add the water, stir it up, and then wait, and then don't add anything else until that compost is done. Then you pull it out and then you start the next batch. I know people who have used them differently and just keep adding stuff all the time. And people have had varying success with that. And again, in large part, it depends on what your goals are. You know, if you aren't that concerned about getting tons of compost, then it doesn't really matter. You can just keep opening it up and throwing more stuff in there until it gets too full and you can't. But if you're trying to speed things along, make everything go as fast as possible, you can get a new batch of compost in like 6 to 8 weeks if you really dial in the recipe and have your ratio of carbon and nitrogen just right. Throw in a little soil or a little finished compost that'll just contain a lot of those microbes that it doesn't have access to on its own, and get things started.
We are, I think we've gotten to the question. So I think maybe it's time for the next video. Works for you?
We'll let her rip.
Okay.
So, now that you've let your pile cook down, and again, it might take like a year or so, maybe 2 years, depending on how hands-on you are, or how happy your microbes are. So now it is time to harvest. So we actually sieve out our compost so that we can throw the chunky monkeys back in to continue composting, or the leaves that are covering up the pile. Now this pile hasn't been cooking very long, so we're probably gonna have a lot of chunky monkeys in there and definitely a lot of leaves. So don't base it upon this. This is just kind of a new pile. So I think this is started in probably like October of last year. So obviously not composting much over the winter. So we have made a sieve out of old 2x4s and some hardware cloth. You can do it however you want. This is the time to engineer, guys, all right? Get on those engineer hats. So we're just gonna dig down in here, and we're just gonna throw it on here. Now, it did just rain, so this is like really wet stuff too, but and as Ethan said, siting it along a tree line is not the wisest thing. And that's just because I just dug into a bunch of roots as well, because they're just coming up and eating it. So you can just move this all over the place like this. The bits of finished compost will fall into your wheelbarrow, or I use a tarp actually at my own house. Because I actually compost with worms, so it's a little different. And, all right. And typically you wouldn't do this when it's like saturated and wet like this, but sometimes you just got to take opportunity where opportunity lies with the weather these days. All right, so like I said, this isn't cooking down all that long, but we're gonna we didn't get much out of there, but we did get, that is the finished compost right there. All right, and I can see some things moving around in there. Ooh, there's a little spider, so don't be afraid. It's all fine. They're all compost critters, all right? They're all our friends. All right, so this stuff is ready to go on your garden and feed those bean plants, feed those spinach plants, or even your flowers. Now, harvesting from the soil saver is very similar, except you got a little door right here. And again, I don't really know what to expect in here. So you've got a little door and you can just kind of shovel it out from underneath. Oh, look at that. All right. Ha. That actually looks pretty darn good. So there's some eggshells in there. Is that going to hurt your garden? Absolutely not. They will break down eventually, all right? So don't worry if there are little pieces of food still left in there uncomposted. You can just turn that right into your soil. It's really not that big of a deal. So that is Harvesting 101.
Okay. So, you ready for some questions, Robin?
Yeah, that's our entire video tour. So it's all Q&A from here on out.
Cool. I've been putting off a question about a green cone. So somebody's been waiting patiently to find out about the claims that you can put dog waste into a green cone. You want to take that one on?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a sticky question. So from a technical standpoint, will it break down? Yes, it will. From an ecological standpoint, is it a good idea? That's something where you're going to get different opinions from different folks. And it probably does to some extent depend on where your site is located. Pet waste can contain a lot of things that are not necessarily great for the environment, chemicals and things. Also, really high levels of nutrients that can contribute to the nutrient overload in our waterways that contributes to the algae blooms. So pet waste is viewed by water quality folks as really hazardous to water health. So if your green cone is going to be located anywhere near a stream or the lake or anything else, then I would recommend against putting pet waste in there. You know, if you're way up on a hill, you don't have any streams nearby, you've got great sandy soil, you know, maybe it's fine. The manufacturers of the green cone do say that you can put food waste in it. So we do believe it will work. But different scientists with different points of view are going to probably have different answers about whether it's a good idea. Pathogen. Oh, there's also just the sort of ickiness factor that with green cones, they don't produce compost, as I mentioned. The nutrients leach out into the soil, but they do leave behind a little sort of ash-like residue, you know, just like at the end of a fire, all the stuff that didn't burn up, it's just the carbon that's left behind. So eventually, the basket part of it that's buried in the soil is going to fill up with that ashy residue, and you're going to need to dig it up and move it to a new location. And to the extent that the stuff above that ashy residue layer is all dog waste, it's probably going to be a little less appealing to do that than if it's food scraps. Not that that's necessarily really enticing, but that might play a role. And just you know, by the nature of opening it, putting stuff through the hole, putting the lid back on, things, you know, food scraps or whatever can get around the outside, you know, around the rim, and that can sort of start to be gross, especially if it's dog waste. And that can be dangerous if you have kids that are, you know, going out there. You don't want them getting that on their hand accidentally and eating it, you know, next time they're eating their sandwich without washing their hands or whatever. Any other points, Ethan?
I just point out that like the bio bags that we do accept for drop-off composting and can be a nice way to keeping the mess off your hands, aren't going to break down in that green cone. So there's not a great way to get the dog waste into the green cone unless you're prepared to, you know, go shovel it in. So and then you do have the problems of it can be a vector for disease. Yeah. Yeah, certainly a personal decision, but it is theoretically, dog waste can theoretically go into a green cone for sure. Whether you want to do that is your choice.
Yeah, and if you are going to do that, I would recommend making sure your green cone is fairly far removed from your garden, where if you're growing food that you're going to eat, you know, if it's perennials, that's another issue. But you know, whatever chemicals or pathogens are leaching out, those can be taken up in the roots of the plants in your garden and then end up in the vegetables that you're eating. So I probably wouldn't, you know, you can also put stuff like that in your compost pile if you want to do that, but I wouldn't recommend using compost that includes dog waste onto any garden that's producing food you're intending to consume. And we do not accept, for all of the reasons above stated, we do not accept pet waste at Green Mountain Compost. So even though it's a choice whether or not to put it in your backyard pile, it is not a choice if you're bringing your food scraps to us at a drop-off center.
Right. Rhonda would be very pleased to know that we've gotten multiple questions about worms.
Oh.
So maybe we'll start with the question about whether there's a benefit to putting earthworms, digging up earthworms and putting them into your compost bin. And then we have a couple of vermicomposting questions.
I'm not the best person to ask about the digging up earthworms thing, because I have a background in forest ecology, and earthworms are all types of earthworms are an invasive species in North America that are actually damaging our forests because they eat all the leaf litter and stuff more quickly than it would ordinarily be digested just through the natural process. And so they cut down on undergrowth, which affects ground nesting birds and deer population and all sorts of things.
But these worms are already there.
So
They're already there.
I'm not a fan of earthworms or trying, yeah, but they are already there. But if you're digging them up and putting them in a compost pile, then you're probably encouraging them to repopulate more quickly. And then you're giving them just a huge, rich environment to get fat and have babies. I don't know. But yeah, it might make your compost go a little faster. They definitely do eat stuff fast.
And I would make a distinction here between hot composting and cold composting. So some people are really trying to achieve those higher temperatures. You're probably not going to hit the 150 degrees we hit in our commercial process, but especially in favorable seasons, like the middle of the summer, you very well might get a hot core of your pile. And earthworms don't have a tolerance for those kind of temperatures. So earthworms are good if your pile is going to be staying cool, and they will help to expedite it because you're not going to have as much of the heat-loving bacteria and fungi that you would if you're getting higher temperatures. So you sort of have an either-or choice. I would also, earthworms are going to find their way into your compost if it's on the ground. So if you're using a tumbler, you could consider throwing some in, and it might have some benefit. Although in general, you're probably trying to do hot composting, in which case you may just end up killing the earthworms you put in there. And then a lot will start up naturally if you're using a different kind of container that's ground sited. Although there are two different ways you can do that. You can put your container right on the ground, or you can put it up on something, and there are benefits to doing it both ways. Do you want to talk about vermicomposting and what the pros and cons are, and why one might do that?
Sure. So Rhonda is our vermicomposting queen. And in fact, and we should have mentioned this earlier, Ethan, we do webinars on a variety of topics, and Rhonda regularly offers them specifically on worm composting. So if that's an interest, I would really encourage you to sign up for one of those. So benefits, it's all inside, so you don't have to go schlepping out through the snowbanks to reach your compost pile in the winter. So it can be super convenient for that reason. Worms are a little more, the red wigglers that you tend to use in vermicomposting, they're a little more fussy. They can't eat everything that you would typically put into a backyard pile. Things that are particularly acidic, I can't remember the whole list, but it's mostly acidic things that I think are the issue. So you have to be a little more careful about what you put in there. Go ahead. It looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's acidic. It's also other rules, and there's both things that are like actively harmful to them. And there's things that they just don't like to eat and won't compost very quickly. And there are lists of both of those widely available. And like we said, we have an expert. So you don't want too much information from us because you'd prefer to get it from Rhonda if you're really going to get serious about vermicomposting. It's a very cool thing. And the biggest pro in my mind is that you can do it through the winter. And so you
Yeah.
don't have that problem that we were talking about earlier. I'll also briefly mention that all of these things we're talking about don't need to be mutually exclusive. So you can do vermicomposting for some of your food scraps, with the bulk of them going to your outdoor pile, and then have that change come winter when you need your worms to take on more of the load, kind of thing. You can also choose to compost the easy stuff, your soft melon, pumpkin, all that kind of stuff, in your backyard, and choose to bring us, for drop-off composting, the tougher stuff, like the meat and bones would be the obvious, but even things like corn cobs and avocado skins that you decide you're done fighting in your backyard. So I always like to point out that a hybrid approach is sometimes nice, and you can get the pros of all of them.
Mm-hmm. And having a green cone and a soil saver can be a good option for some folks, because the meat stuff that can't go into the backyard, you can toss into the green cone instead. And that way you're less likely to overload the green cone, which, they can be a little fussy. They definitely require very specific site conditions, as Ethan mentioned earlier, and whether or not they can keep up with the load, with the amount of food scraps your household is producing, especially in the winter when things slow down, is an open question. We know people who have had great luck, and other people who have found it a little frustrating. So having both, where you can put the majority of your things in the backyard compost, and then just the problematic items into the green cone, is a good way to balance things out.
We had one comment, Robin, that I thought was a good one to share with everybody, because it was somebody noting a working system that they use. I have 3 compost. This is Joyce. I have 3 compost bins, like the black one you showed, like soil saver. I take it. I keep 2 to add to. The third one I have my compost that is breaking down for the second year. Then all seeds may have already sprouted. So I just empty the one that has been breaking down for 2 years. I do stir it every once in a while. It works very well. I have a pail of frozen stuff in the garage, and when it's warm enough to get it out there, it is simple and easy. I'm over 80 and can handle it just fine.
Wow.
Nicely done,
Great
Joyce.
work, Joyce.
So yeah, I think that's a great example of how to use batch composting effectively. And Joyce is addressing something that came up in another question that I answered via the chat, and that is just that backyard composting is unlikely to reach the temperatures that you need to kill the weed seeds. And so you either just tolerate that and know you're going to have those as a result of them coming through your compost a bit, or apparently you can have it sit another year and know that they will have sprouted and be already dead and done by the time that you're putting your compost in your garden, which is a cool strategy.
I've gotten squash and tomatoes growing out of my soil saver, which is great. They grow really fast. They've got all the nutrients they want. You do get some weird squash hybrids if you eat different kinds of squash and throw all the seeds in there. They can you can get some weird shapes and colors.
Jane mentions, Robin, that she'll need a webinar on earthworms as an invasive species specifically.
I know of one. A professor of mine gave one probably 10 years ago. I'm sure it's on YouTube. I'll look around for it.
There was a question at one point from Tricia about what a step whether a step differs in the soil saver. I assume that was like the turning and flipping, and hopefully we talked about that. If you have multiple soil savers, you can certainly flip from one into the other, and that's a great way to turn it. Always, if you can, from one container into another. The other thing you can do that somebody in another waste district pointed out to me is you just pull your soil saver off the pile. So you just lift it up and you put it next to where it had been, and where your food scraps are now sitting in a pile and then you shovel that pile back into your container in its new spot. So you don't need 2 soil savers if you do it that way. I was never able to, because I learned the hard way that the tree roots around would lock it into place if I wasn't careful.
Yeah.
Another question for you, Robin. Devin is using 2 tumblers, and if have heard one should be used to cook while the other is used to add to. Should they both be rotated regularly?
Sure. I mean, you can't rotate it too much. Like, there's no harm in rotating it too much. So yeah, I'd give it a spin every time I walked past it. Whether or not you have to, if that's the question, I don't know the answer to that. I don't have a lot of personal experience with those. You've used a tumbler, Ethan, haven't you?
Yep. And I have a similar answer to yours. I'd say that, yes, regardless of what stage it is of the process, unless it's completely finished, in which case you don't really need to manage it at all, you do want to be monitoring both moisture and air, providing air by tumbling it. The only thing I'd add to what Robin said about no such thing as tumbling it too often is that in colder temperatures, if you really are trying to pursue hot composting, and that is a tough thing to do in a tumbler because their volumes are always even smaller than a soil saver. But if you are trying to do that as the weather turns, then you're really not going to be able to get a core temp at all because it's all going to be exposed. There's no insulation at that point to keep the core temp.
And if
But
it's
in general,
lump, turning it isn't going to make any difference.
But yeah, in general, like turning tumblers is what they're for, and it's good to turn them frequently and have it be well aerated. Tricia says, notes like say pulling it off. I think it also add another pallet bay and move it into there. Yep. That's totally an option. And in fact, in the winter when everything's frozen, you can get away with things that you would never do in the summer, like leave it in a 5-gallon bucket frozen outside until your compost is accessible for you to add it to. Or, and I say this cautiously because it's not for every situation, and please respect your neighbors. But if it's going to stay frozen and you run out of space in your bin, you could pile it next to your bin under the snow, as long as you're prepared to get in your bin as soon as it thaws out, so that animals are not having a heyday, because you don't want to become the bear's breakfast spot for the neighborhood. But when everything's frozen solid in the winter, that's probably something that if you don't have another container, you could do.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We are running low on the question count here.
Excellent.
We can mention that we do have more information available at Soil Savers. We talked about how they take different materials. They're very sort of site fussy, and
Green cones,
that dog. So excuse me, green cones. Thank you. Green cones take different materials than Soil Savers. Green cones are particularly citing fussy in that they need direct sunlight, so they warm up. They need well draining soil, and they also, if you're going to put dog waste into them, you want to make sure that they're not near a water source or your vegetable garden.
And we do have how long is that video? Like 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes?
I think, yeah, it might be closer to 5, but it's not long. So we could show that.
We do have a video on that. So those who are interested can stick around till the end. We'll show it once we've wrapped up everybody else's questions. Those who are not interested in the green cone can sign off, and those who want to see it can stay with us and learn a little more about that option.
And Laura reminds me that I had wanted to just touch on drop-off composting because we had a question earlier about that. And so we take compost for our commercial process at Green Mountain Compost, our organics facility, at all of our drop-off centers. So if you're coming to our drop-off center to drop off trash, you're paying for that trash, and you can drop off up to 5 gallons of food scraps at no charge. If you are not paying for trash and you're just bringing food scraps or other free stuff, then you will pay $1 for your 5-gallon bucket of food scraps at most drop-off centers, or $1 for every 5 gallons. It doesn't have to be in a 5-gallon bucket. But there is a no-charge option, and that is to bring it to the drop-off location that is closest to our compost facility, so we don't have to bring it very far ourselves, and that's our Williston drop-off center. So there, open Monday through Saturday, 8 to 3:30, you can drop off up to 30 gallons of food scraps at no charge. So it is still free there.
And there initially, when we moved that no charge container from Green Mountain Compost, we because of a construction project, we moved it down the road to that drop-off center. We did notice an uptick in traffic, and some folks who had used that container at its previous location found it frustrating to have to wait behind cars that were, paying for trash, and it took so just last week we finally were able to reconfigure things. So there are 2 lanes. So if you have only food scraps, there's a sort of an express lane for you to go through without having to wait behind cars that are doing more complicated transactions. So if you have heard that it's a hassle there because it takes too long, that was true, but it may not be true currently. So it's worth giving it a whirl.
Great. Other questions? Green cone was here when I bought the property. How do I know if it needs to be moved?
When it stops doing anything, if you stick a little pitchfork or shovel down in there and just pull aside some of the fresh food scraps, basically what's in the ground, and if you stay for the video, you'll get to see a picture of what it is that's buried in the ground. It's just basically looks like a laundry basket with bigger holes. That is buried so that the top of the basket is right at ground level. And basically when the ash residue gets up to that point, when the basket is full, that's when you're going to need to move it. You can move it earlier, but you don't need to until that container is full. And how long that's going to take is going to depend on all sorts of factors, including your site location and the volume of material that you and your family are generating and putting in there. So just keep an eye on it. If it seems like nothing's happening for a while, consider digging down there with a shovel just to see if maybe the ash stuff is all the way up to the rim, in which case dig it up, dump that ash stuff into the woods or under a shrub, whatever, and then dig a fresh hole.
Great. At this point, we have one left, although happy to answer any other questions come in. I need another black composter. Any discounts or low-cost options?
I don't know if discount is the right word, but we sell them at cost here. So for Chittenden County residents, and the price right now is $60, if I recall correctly. So there was a time a couple of years ago when we had gotten a grant from the state, and all of the solid waste districts did, and we were able to sell them at 50% of our cost because the grant covered the other 50%. But that was a one-time bonus. So, and we have no expectation that will happen again. So $60 is the price, which is still about, I'm going to say roughly half of what the typical retail price would be, maybe a little more than half.
Yeah, I tend to think that's probably about the best price you'll find that style of composter, the basic box style.
And the green ones we sell, those are $130, which also is roughly half-ish of somewhere 40 to 60% of the typical retail price for those. So they're discounted to the extent that we aren't in business to make a profit. We're here just trying to make these resources available to you. So we are able to buy them in bulk, so we get better prices, and then we're able to sell them to you, just basically passing through our costs.
And there are lots of options out there for both soil saver type products and tumbler type products, a zillion variations. One of the things we'd like about our soil savers is that they are made from, I don't remember what the percentage is, but it's a lot of recycled plastic.
Yeah.
It's what?
It's a high percentage is all I know. I don't remember. I don't think it's 100, but it's a good number. The other thing though to keep in mind is you do not need to buy anything. Like we did it growing up. We lived out in the country, so we didn't have the neighbors issue. But we just had a big old pile right next to our garden, so that it was handy to throw weeds in there when we were taking care of the garden. And then we just made another pile next to it. We put that wood pallet 3-bay thing together in like a half an hour one day. We went up the road to the drop-off center, grabbed some pallets out of the wood pile, and just 6 or 8 screws, and it's just sitting there. And you could put a couple of sawhorses out with an old door behind it, anything you want to do to just create the sense of space around it that makes it look a little more intentional than just like a random pile of stuff. You know, it's entirely up to you, but there's no reason to spend a lot of money to make this happen. Nature will do the work. It doesn't need anything fancy. Some people like to have fancier things, or just people have different aesthetic tastes. And so it definitely looks a lot neater and cleaner in a container like a soil saver than it does even in a 3-bay system, but definitely more than it does in just a big old pile.
No more questions. So and we've some people had to go. So I will show the green cone video if that works for you, Robin.
That sounds perfect.
Cool.
And then we can stay for another couple of minutes if people have questions about that.
Mm-hmm.
Now we'll move on to the green cone. This is not a composter. This is a digester, meaning you aren't going to get a finished product to put in the garden, but we'll take all of your food scraps, including meat, bones, dairy, and oils. It sits in the ground, so you're basically going to put all your food scraps, and only your food scraps. No leaves, garden trimmings, or paper towels. Nothing like that. So no browns, only strictly food scraps. So what has happened is that the way that it is shaped, the cones do provide some insulation or the air. So the black cone will go on the inside, all right? And the green cone will sit on the outside. And the air gets trapped in between the two cones. It'll heat up, warming the inside of the cone as well as provide insulation to keep the heat in. Last year, I took the temperature of this green cone and it registered about 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So that heat dehydrates all of the food, and then a certain community of microbes come in and eat up the dehydrated food. They won't produce compost because, as you guessed it, they won't have those browns to make the compost. This is an entirely different group of microbes than you would find in your compost piles. What they will do is break that food down into smaller molecules that will then wash away into the surrounding soil. But if you put your green cone near a garden, it is recommended that you put it next to a flower garden, not a food garden, because you could be adding raw meats, and this will ensure no harmful bacteria make it to your food garden. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the soil is sandy or at least well-drained soil. If you don't have well-drained soil, the green cone directions do provide different ways to create a well-drained site, or you can look it up online. Make sure it is sited in the full sun. We had our green cone sited along the tree line originally when there were no leaves on the trees. So it was sunny at the time. But once those leaves popped out, it became very shady and it did not work. So we had to move it over here. So the sun is necessary, and well-drained soil is a necessity too. All right, so you'll want to dig a hole in the ground. All right, whoops, don't do that. About 2.5 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep. I started to dig a hole earlier, so I'll continue on digging. The soil is very sandy, so this is a perfect spot for a green cone location. So once you get a bit dug out, you want to make sure that your basket fits. So make sure that happens. And then you can just flip your basket upside down to make sure that the diameter is good. And you want to continue on digging out the hole. So once the hole is dug, you're going to attach the cones to the basket using the provided hardware. Then the whole unit will sit in the ground. It will sit underground, including where the cones and baskets are attached. So many folks ask me if pests try to get into the green cone. I have not experienced that at all, and we have lots of pests hanging around compost. And thus far, no attempts have been witnessed. So once you get it all assembled, you can pop it into the ground, fill it in with soil, and you can begin digesting your food scraps and keeping them out of the landfill.
with your green cone, you will be getting the Sandy Dandy Kitchen Food Scrap Collector. All right. Although it comes with it, it's a little weird shaped. I personally prefer to use something a little smaller, round, because it'll fit really nice in that hole. So that's how I roll. This is just an old ice cream container, but this will come with it. You'll get instructions on how to assemble it and use it, as well as some green cone accelerant. All it really is dehydrated microbes, that special community that is used for this kind of digestion, all right, not composting. So whole different makeup than what you would find in your backyard composting. Okay, so once you have your green cone all set up and ready to use, now I'm gonna demonstrate how one does it. It's pretty easy, and again, it is not a composter. It is just going to digest your food away. So you can put anything in here, meat, bones, dairy, oil, anything food related. You don't want to put any like paper towels or leaves or garden trimmings in here. You strictly want to use food, okay, like your food. So you're going to come down and you can see this little latch right here. I'm going to flip that open. And I'm going to give you a little looky-see of what it looks like in here. All right. You can see a lot of mold. Oops, sorry. A lot of mold, all right, which is good. That's a good sign. All right. I am going to just add these food scraps. Now I'm just collecting these food scraps in an old ice cream container. All right. Let's see if I can get this open with one hand. All right. The smaller the opening, the better, because this opening is not very big, and you want to make sure that when you're dumping it in, that it all fits nicely in there. Now, one of the things that I have discovered by using the green cone is that you want to wipe the rim off and the inside of the lid, because in this hot, warm summer, and this thing will kick up heat quickly, all right? And it's pretty toasty in there right now. But you want to wipe the rim off, because flies will get in there and it's nice and moist, and they'll lay their eggs, and you might come out to some surprises. So I just usually keep a cloth nearby, or carry it with me, and then just take it and wipe the inside rim off, and then wipe around the lid as well, all right? Once you add your food, you can take your magic powder here, the green cone accelerant, and just do a little sprinkle dinkle do in there, all right? So it's kind of like seasoning it up a little bit. You don't need a whole lot. If you run out of accelerant and you don't want to purchase anymore, I typically use just a handful of soil too. So there will be microbes in the soil around it that will be effective. So you can just do that as well. Close the bad boy back up, and you are finito. And that is how you use the green cone.
All right. We do have one more question about whether we sell replacement lids for green cones, I assume is the answer to this question.
I assume so. And yes, we do have those. If you go to the Green Mountain Compost website and click around like you want to buy one, there's a number to call to buy one over the phone. Just call that number, and you'll be talking to Rhonda and tell her you need a new lid, and she'll help you out.
Great, and that's that. Oh, yep, that does it. So I think that's everything, and we appreciate everyone tuning in.
Yes, thanks
It's
very
now
much.
11:30. So, yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. And you know how to reach us via our hotline, 872-8111, or
Yep.
you'll have our emails.
And I did forget to mention that we will be sending you a follow-up email. It's going to come, I think, on Tuesday. It will have a video of this webinar, and links to a whole bunch of other resources. So, so that will be coming, and that will also give our contact information again. All right, thanks again. Have a great weekend.